The Phoenix Theatre and Arts Company's audio drama series presents Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Part 3, adapted and directed by Jenna Isabella. For past episodes, upcoming events, and other information, make sure to visit our website at phoenixtheatreartsco.com. That's theater with an R-E. Without further ado, we give you Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Part 3.
Chapter 7. A Mad Tea Party. There was a table set out under a tree in front of the house, and the March Hare and the Hatter were having tea at it. A dormouse was sitting between them, fast asleep, and the other two were using it as a cushion, resting their elbows on it and talking over its head.
Very uncomfortable for the dormouse,
thought Alice.
Only, as it's asleep, I suppose it doesn't mind.
The table was a large one, but the three were all crowded together at one corner of it.
No room!
No room!
They cried out when they saw Alice coming.
There's plenty of room,
said Alice indignantly, and she sat down in a large armchair at one end of the table.
Have some wine,
the March Hare said in an encouraging tone. Alice looked all around the table, but there was nothing on it but tea.
I don't see any wine.
There isn't any.
Then it wasn't very civil of you to offer it.
It wasn't very civil of you to sit down without being invited.
I didn't know it was your table. It's laid for a great many more than 3.
Your hair wants cutting,
said the Hatter. He had been looking at Alice for some time with great curiosity, and this was his first speech.
You should learn not to make personal remarks. It's very rude.
The Hatter opened his eyes very wide on hearing this, but all he said was,
Why is a raven like a writing desk?
Come, we shall have some fun now,
thought Alice.
I'm glad they've begun asking riddles. I believe I can guess that.
What do you mean that you think you can find out the answer to it?
Said the March Hare.
Exactly so.
Then you should say what you mean.
I do. At least, I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know.
Not the same thing a bit. You might just as well say that I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see,
said the Hatter.
You might just as well say that I like what I get is the same thing as I get what I like,
added the March Hare.
You might just as well say that I breathe when I sleep is the same thing as I sleep when I breathe,
added the Dormouse, who seemed to be talking in his sleep.
It is the same thing with you,
said the Hatter, and here the conversation dropped, and the party sat silent for a minute, while Alice thought over all she could remember about ravens and writing desks, which wasn't much. The Hatter was the first to break the silence.
What day of the month is it?
He said, turning to Alice. He had taken his watch out of his pocket and was looking at it uneasily, shaking it every now and then, and holding it up to his ear. Alice considered a little and then said,
The 4th?
2 days wrong. I told you butter wouldn't suit the works.
It was the best butter.
Yes, but some crumbs must have gotten in as well. You shouldn't have put it in with the bread knife.
The March Hare took the watch and looked at it gloomily. Then he dipped it into his cup of tea and looked at it again. But he could think of nothing better to say than his first remark.
It was the best butter, you know.
Alice had been looking over his shoulder with some curiosity.
What a funny watch. It tells the day of the month and doesn't tell what o'clock it is.
Why should it? Does your watch tell you what year it is?
Well, of course not. But that's because it stays the same year for such a long time together.
Which is just the case with mine,
said the Hatter. Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. The Hatter's remarks seemed to have no sort of meaning in it, and yet it was certainly English. As politely as she could, Alice said,
I don't quite understand you.
The dormouse is asleep again,
said the Hatter, and he poured a little hot tea upon its nose. The dormouse shook its head impatiently and said without opening its eyes,
Of course. just what I was going to remark myself.
Have you guessed the riddle yet?
The Hatter asked, turning to Alice again.
No, I give up. What's the answer?
I haven't the slightest idea.
Said the Hatter.
Nor I.
Said the March Hare.
I think you might do something better with your time than waste it in asking riddles that have no answers.
If you knew time as well as I do, you wouldn't talk about wasting it. It's him.
I don't know what you mean.
Of course you don't.
The Hatter said, tossing his head contemptuously.
I dare say you never even spoke to time.
Perhaps not, but I know I have to beat time when I learn music.
Ah, that accounts for it. He won't stand beating. If you only kept on good terms with him, he'd do almost anything you'd like with a clock. For instance, suppose it were 9 o'clock in the morning, just time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper a hint to time, and round goes the clock in a twinkling. 1:30, time for dinner.
I only wish it was.
That would be grand, certainly, but then I shouldn't be hungry for it, you know.
Not at first, perhaps, but you could keep it up 1:30 as long as you like.
Is that the way you manage?
The Hatter shook his head mournfully.
Not I. We quarreled last March, just before he went mad, you know.
Then the Hatter, pointing with his teaspoon at the March Hare,
It was a great concert given by the Queen of Hearts, and I had to sing. A twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder what you're at. You know the song, perhaps?
I've heard something like it.
It goes on, you know, in this way. Up above the world you fly, like the tea tray in the sky. Twinkle, twinkle.
Here the Dormouse shook itself and began singing in its sleep.
Twinkle, 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 twinkle.
And went on so long
twinkle.
that they had to pinch it to make it stop.
Well, I'd hardly finished the first verse when the Queen jumped up and bawled out, "He's murdering the time! Off with his head!"
How dreadfully savage!
And ever since that, he won't do a thing I ask. It's always 6 o'clock now.
A bright idea came into Alice's head.
Is that the reason so many tea things are put out here?
Yes, that's it. It's always tea time, and we've no time to wash the things between whiles.
Then you keep moving around, I suppose.
Exactly so, as the things get used up.
But what happens when you come to the beginning again?
Suppose we change the subject.
The March Hare interrupted, yawning.
Oh, I'm getting tired of this. I vote the young lady tells us a story.
I'm afraid I don't know one.
Then the Dormouse shall.
Wake up, Dormouse.
And they pinched it on both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened his eyes.
I wasn't asleep. I heard every word you fellows were saying.
Tell us a story.
Yes, please do.
And be quick about it, or you'll be asleep again before it's done.
Once upon a time, there were 3 little sisters, and their names were Elsie, Lacey, and Tilly. And they lived at the bottom of a well.
What did they live on?
Said Alice, who always took a great interest in questions of eating and drinking.
They lived on treacle.
Said the Dormouse, after thinking a minute or two.
They couldn't have done that, you know. They'd have been ill.
So they were very ill.
Alice tried to fancy to herself what such an extraordinary way of living would be like, but it puzzled her too much, so she went on.
But why did they live at the bottom of a well?
Take some more tea.
The March Hare said to Alice, very earnestly.
I've had nothing yet, so I can't take more.
You mean you can't take less? It's very easy to take more than nothing.
Nobody asked your opinion.
Who's making personal remarks now?
The Hatter asked triumphantly. Alice did not quite know what to say to this, so she helped herself to some tea and bread and butter, and then turned to the Dormouse and repeated her question.
Why did they live at the bottom of a well?
The Dormouse again took a minute or two to think about it, and then said,
It was a treacle well.
There's no such thing.
if you can't be civil, you better finish the story for yourself.
No, please go on. I won't interrupt again. I dare say there may be one.
One indeed.
said the Dormouse indignantly. However, he consented to go on.
And so these three little sisters, they were learning to draw, you know.
What did they draw?
Treacle.
I want a clean cup. Let's all move one place on.
The Hatter moved on as he spoke, and the Dormouse followed him. The March Hare moved into the Dormouse's place, and Alice rather unwillingly took the place of the March Hare. The Hatter was the only one who got any advantage from the change, and Alice was a good deal worse off than before, as the March Hare had just upset the milk jug onto his plate. Alice did not wish to offend the Dormouse again, so she began very cautiously.
But I don't understand. Where did they draw the treacle from?
You can draw water out of a water well, so I should think you could draw a treacle out of a treacle well. Eh? Stupid.
But they were in the well.
Of course they were. Well in.
This answer so confused poor Alice that she let the Dormouse go on for some time without interrupting it.
They were learning to draw.
The Dormouse went on, yawning and rubbing its eyes, for it was getting very sleepy.
And they drew all manner of things. Everything that begins with an M.
Oh, why with an M?
The Dormouse had closed its eyes by this time and was going off into a doze. But, on being pinched by the Hatter, it woke up again with a little shriek and went on.
That begins with an M, such as mousetraps, and the moon, and memory, and muchness. You know, you say things are of a muchness. Did you ever see a thing as a drawing of muchness?
Really, now you ask me. I don't think...
Then you shouldn't talk.
This piece of rudeness was more than Alice could bear. She got up in great disgust and walked off. The Dormouse fell asleep instantly, and neither of the others took the least notice of her going, though she looked back once or twice, half hoping that they would call after her. The last she saw them, they were trying to put the Dormouse into a teapot.
At any rate, I'll never go there again,
said Alice as she picked her way through the wood.
It's the stupidest tea party I ever was at in my whole life.
Just as she said this, she noticed that one of the trees had a door leading right into it.
That's very curious, but everything's curious today. I think I may as well go in at once,
she thought, and in she went. Once more she found herself in the long hall and close to the little glass table.
Now I'll manage better this time,
she said to herself, and began by taking the little golden key and unlocking the door that led into the garden. Then she went to work nibbling at the mushroom. She had kept a piece of it in her pocket till she was about a foot high. Then she walked down the little passage, and then she found herself at last in the beautiful garden, among the bright flower beds and the cool fountains. Chapter 8. The Queen's Croquet Ground. A large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. Alice thought this a very curious thing, and she went nearer to watch them, and just as she came up to them, she heard one of them say,
Look out now, Five. Don't go splashing paint all over me like that.
I couldn't help it. 7 jogged me elbow.
On which 7 looked up and said,
That's right, Five. Always lay the blame on others.
You'd better not talk. I heard the Queen say only yesterday that you deserve to be beheaded.
What for?
It's none of your business, too.
Yes, it is his business, and I'll tell him. It was for bringing the cook tulip roots instead of onions.
7 flung down his brush and had just begun to speak.
Well, of all the unjust things,
when his eye chanced to fall upon Alice as she stood watching them, and he checked himself suddenly. The others looked round also, and all of them bowed low.
Would you tell me, why are you painting those roses?
5 and 7 said nothing, but looked at 2. 2 began in a low voice.
Why, the fact is, you see, miss, this here ought to have been a red rose tree, but we put a white one in by mistake. And if the Queen was to find out, we should all have our heads cut off, you know. So you see, miss, we're doing our best afore she comes to...
At this moment, 5, who had been anxiously looking across the garden, called out,
"The Queen! The Queen!"
and the 3 gardeners instantly threw themselves flat upon their faces. There was a sound of many footsteps, and Alice looked round, eager to see the Queen. First came 10 soldiers carrying clubs. These were all shaped like the 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, with their hands and feet at the corners. Next, the 10 courtiers. These were ornamented all over with diamonds and walked 2 and 2 as the soldiers did. After these came the royal children. There were 10 of them, and the little dears came jumping merrily along hand in couples. They were all ornamented with hearts. Next came the guests, mostly kings and queens, and among them Alice recognized the White Rabbit. It was talking in a hurried, nervous manner, smiling at everything that was said, and went by without noticing her. Then followed the Knave of Hearts, carrying the king's crown on a crimson velvet cushion. And last of all of this grand procession came the King and Queen of Hearts. Alice was rather doubtful whether she ought not to lie down on her face like the 3 gardeners, but she could not remember ever having heard of such a rule at processions.
And besides, what would be the use of a procession if people had to lie down upon their faces so they couldn't see it?
She thought, so she stood still where she was and waited. When the procession came opposite to Alice, they all stopped and looked at her, and the Queen said severely,
"Who is this?"
She said it to the Knave of Hearts, who only bowed and smiled in reply.
"Idiot,"
said the Queen, tossing her head impatiently, and turning to Alice, she went on.
"What's your name, child?"
My name is Alice, so please your majesty.
Said Alice very politely, but she added to herself,
Why, they're only a pack of cards after all. I needn't be afraid of them.
"And who are these?"
said the Queen, pointing to the 3 gardeners who were lying round the rose tree. For you see, as they were lying on their faces, and the pattern on their backs was the same as the rest of the pack, she could not tell whether they were gardeners, or soldiers, or courtiers, or 3 of her own children.
How should I know? It's no business of mine.
The Queen turned crimson with fury, and after glaring at her for a moment like a wild beast, screamed,
"Off with her head! Off!"
Nonsense!
said Alice, very loudly and decidedly, and the Queen was silent. The King laid his hand upon her arm and timidly said,
"Consider, my dear, she is only a child."
The Queen turned angrily away from him and said to the Knave.
"Turn them over."
The Knave did so, very carefully, with 1 foot.
"Get up!"
And the 3 gardeners instantly jumped up and began bowing to the King, the Queen, the royal children, and everyone else.
"Leave off that! You make me giddy."
And then, turning to the rose tree, she went on.
"What have you been doing here?"
May it please your majesty,
Said two, in a very humble tone, going down on 1 knee as he spoke.
we were trying.
"I see.
Said the Queen, who had meanwhile been examining the roses.
Off with their heads!"
And the procession moved on, 3 of the soldiers remaining behind to execute the unfortunate gardeners who ran to Alice for protection.
You shan't be beheaded.
Said Alice, and she put them into a large flower pot that stood near. The 3 soldiers wandered about for a minute or 2, looking for them, and then quietly marched off after the others.
"All their heads off!"
The heads are gone, if it please your majesty.
"That's right. Can you play croquet?"
The soldiers were silent and looked at Alice, as the question was evidently meant for her.
Yes.
"Come on, then."
And so Alice joined the procession, wondering very much what would happen next.
It's a very fine day.
Said a timid voice at her side. She was walking by the White Rabbit, who was peeping anxiously into her face.
Where's the Duchess?
Hush, hush.
Said the rabbit in a low, hurried tone. He looked anxiously over his shoulder as he spoke, and then raised himself upon tiptoe, put his mouth close to her ear, and whispered.
She's under sentence of execution.
What for?
She boxed the Queen's ears. Oh, hush! The Queen will hear you. You see, she came rather late, and the Queen said,
"Get to your places."
"Oh."
People began running about in all directions, tumbling up against each other. However, they got settled down in a minute or 2, and the game began. Alice thought she had never seen such a curious croquet ground in her life. It was all ridges and furrows. The balls were live hedgehogs, the mallets live flamingos, and the soldiers had to double themselves up and to stand on their hands and feet to make the arches. The chief difficulty that Alice found at first was in managing her flamingo. She had succeeded in getting its body tucked away, comfortably enough, underneath her arm, with its legs hanging down, but generally, just as she had got its neck nicely straightened out and was going to give the hedgehog a blow with its head, it would twist itself around and look up in her face with such a puzzled expression that she could not help bursting out laughing. And when she had got its head down and was going to begin again, it was very provoking to find that the hedgehog had unrolled itself and was in the act of crawling away. Besides all this, there was generally a ridge or furrow in the way wherever she wanted to send the hedgehog to. And as the doubled-up soldiers were always getting up and walking off to other parts of the ground, Alice soon came to the conclusion that it was a very difficult game indeed. The players all played at once without waiting for turns, quarreling all the while, and fighting for the hedgehogs. And in a very short time the queen was in a furious passion, and went stamping about and shouting,
Off with his head!
or
Off with her head!
about once a minute. Alice began to feel very uneasy. To be sure, she had not as yet had any dispute with the queen, but she knew that it might happen any minute. And then, thought she,
What would become of me? They're dreadfully fond of beheading people here. The great wonder is that there's anyone left alive at all.
She was looking about for some way to escape, and wondering whether she could get away without being seen, when she noticed a curious appearance in the air. It puzzled her very much at first, but after watching it a minute or two, she made it out to be a grin, and she said to herself,
It's the Cheshire Cat. Now I shall have somebody to talk to.
How are you getting on?
said the cat, as soon as there was mouth enough for it to speak with. Alice waited till the eyes appeared, and then thought,
It's no use speaking to it till its ears have come, or at least one of them.
In another minute the whole head appeared, and then Alice put down her flamingo and began an account of the game, feeling very glad she had someone to listen to her. The cat seemed to think that there was enough of it now in sight, and no more of it appeared.
I don't think they play at all fairly, and they all quarrel so dreadfully one can't hear oneself speak. And they don't seem to have any rules in particular, at least if there are, nobody attends to them, and you've no idea how confusing it is, all the things being alive. For instance, there's the arch I've got to go through next, walking about at the other end of the ground, and I should have croqueted the queen's hedgehog just now, only it ran away when it saw mine coming.
How do you like the queen?
Not at all. She's so extremely...
Just then she noticed that the queen was close behind her listening, so she went on.
likely to win, that it's hardly worthwhile finishing the game.
The queen smiled and passed on.
Who are you talking to?
Said the king, going up to Alice and looking at the cat's head with great curiosity.
It's a friend of mine, a Cheshire cat. Allow me to introduce you to it.
I don't like the look of it at all. However, it may kiss my hand if it likes. I'd rather not. Don't be impertinent, and don't look at me like that.
He got behind Alice as he spoke.
A cat may look at a king. I've read that in some books, but I don't remember where.
Well, it must be removed,
said the king very decidedly, and he called the queen, who was passing at the moment.
My dear, I wish you would have this cat removed.
The queen had only one way of settling all difficulties, great or small.
Off with his head,
she said, without even looking round.
I'll fetch the executioner myself,
said the king eagerly, and he hurried off. Alice thought she might as well go back and see how the game was going on, as she heard the queen's voice in the distance, screaming with passion. She had already heard her sentence 3 of the players to be executed for having missed their turns, and she did not like the look of things at all, as the game was in such confusion that she never knew whether it was her turn or not. So she went in search of her hedgehog. The hedgehog was engaged in a fight with another hedgehog, which seemed to Alice an excellent opportunity for croqueting one of them with the other. The only difficulty was that her flamingo was gone across to the other side of the garden, where Alice could see it trying in a helpless sort of a way to fly up into a tree. By the time she had caught the flamingo and brought it back, the hedgehog fight was over, and both of the hedgehogs were out of sight. And Alice thought,
But it doesn't matter much, as all the arches are gone from this side of the ground.
So she tucked the flamingo away under her arm, that it might not escape again, and went back for a little more conversation with her friend. When she got back to the Cheshire Cat, she was surprised to find quite a large crowd collected round it. There was a dispute about the Duchess's head going on between the executioner, the king, and the queen, who were all talking at once, while all the rest were quite silent and looked very uncomfortable. Alice could think of nothing else to say but,
It belongs to the Duchess. You'd better ask her about it.
She is in prison. Fetch her here.
the queen said to the executioner, and the executioner went off like an arrow. The cat's head began fading away the moment he was gone, and by the time he had come back with the Duchess, it had entirely disappeared. So the king and the executioner ran wildly up and down looking for it, while the rest of the party went back to the game. Chapter 9. The Mock Turtle Story.
You can't think how glad I am to see you again, you dear old thing,
said the Duchess as she tucked her arm affectionately into Alice's, and they walked off together. Alice was very glad to find her in such a pleasant temper, and thought to herself that perhaps it was only the pepper that had made her so savage when they met in the kitchen.
When I'm a Duchess, I won't have any pepper in my kitchen at all. Soup does very well without. Maybe it's always pepper that makes people hot-tempered, and vinegar that makes them sour, and chamomile that makes them bitter, and barley sugar, and such things that make children sweet-tempered. I only wish people knew that. Then they wouldn't be so stingy about it, you know.
She had quite forgotten the Duchess by this time, and was a little startled when she heard her voice close to her ear.
You're thinking about something, my dear, and that makes you forget to talk. I can't tell you just now what the moral of that is, but I shall remember it in a bit.
Perhaps it hasn't one.
Tut, child. Everything has got a moral, if only you can find it.
And she squeezed herself up closer to Alice's side as she spoke. Alice did not much like keeping so close to her. First, because the Duchess was very ugly, and secondly, because she was exactly the right height to rest her chin upon Alice's shoulder, and it was an uncomfortably sharp chin. However, she did not like to be rude, and so she bore it as well as she could.
The game's going on rather better now,
she said, by way of keeping up the conversation a little.
'Tis so, and the moral of that is, oh, 'tis love, that makes the world go round.
Somebody said that it's done by everybody minding their own business.
Ah, well, it means much the same thing, and the moral of that is take care of the scents, and the sounds will take care of themselves.
How fond she is of finding morals and things.
Alice thought to herself.
I dare say you're wondering why I don't put my arm round your waist. The reason is that I'm doubtful about the temper of your flamingo. Shall I try an experiment?
He might bite.
Very true. Flamingos and mustard both bite, and the moral of that is birds of a feather flock together.
Only mustard isn't a bird.
Right, as usual. What a clear way you have of putting things.
It's a mineral, I think.
Of course it is. There's a large mustard mine near here, and the moral of that is, the more there is of mine, the less there is of yours.
Oh, I know, it's a vegetable. It doesn't look like one, but it is.
I quite agree with you. And the moral of that is, be what you would seem to be, or, if you'd like to put it more simply, never imagine yourself not to be otherwise than what it might appear to others, that what you were or might have been was not otherwise than what you had been would have appeared to them to be otherwise.
I think I should understand that better if I had written it down, but I can't quite follow it as you say it.
That's nothing to what I could say if I chose.
Pray, don't trouble yourself to say it any longer than that.
Oh, don't talk about trouble. I make you a present of everything I've said as yet.
Cheap sort of present. I'm glad they don't give birthday presents like that.
Alice thought, but she did not venture to say it out loud.
Thinking again.
I've a right to think.
Just about as much right as pigs have to fly, and
But here, to Alice's great surprise, the Duchess's voice died away. Even in the middle of her favorite word, moral, and the arm that was linked into hers began to tremble. Alice looked up, and there stood the queen in front of them, with her arms folded, frowning like a thunderstorm.
A fine day, your majesty.
Now I give you fair warning.
Stamping on the ground as she spoke.
Either you or your head must be off, and that in about half no time. Take your choice.
The Duchess took her choice and was gone in a moment.
Let's go on with the game.
The queen said to Alice, and Alice was too frightened to say a word, but slowly followed her back to the croquet ground. The other guests had taken advantage of the queen's absence and were resting in the shade. However, the moment they saw her, they hurried back to the game, the queen merely remarking that a moment's delay would cost them their lives. All the time they were playing, the queen never left off quarreling with the other players and shouting,
"Off with his head!"
or
"Off with her head!"
Those whom she sentenced were taken into custody by the soldiers, who of course had to leave off being arches to do this, so that by the end of half an hour or so, there were no arches left, and all the players, except the king, the queen, and Alice, were in custody or under sentence of execution. Then the queen left off, quite out of breath, and said to Alice,
"Have you seen the mock turtle yet?"
No, I don't even know what a mock turtle is.
It's the thing mock turtle soup is made from.
I never saw one, or heard of one.
Come on then, and he shall tell you his history.
As they walked off together, Alice heard the king say in a low voice to the company, generally,
You are all pardoned!
Come, that's a good thing.
she said to herself, for she had felt quite unhappy at the number of executions the queen had ordered. They very soon came upon a griffin, lying fast asleep in the sun.
Up, lazy thing, and take this young lady to see the mock turtle, and to hear his history. I must go back and see after some executions I've ordered.
And she walked off, leaving Alice alone with the griffin. Alice did not quite like the look of the creature, but on the whole she thought it would be quite as safe to stay with it as to go after that savage queen, so she waited. The griffin sat up and rubbed its eyes. Then it watched the queen till she was out of sight. Then it chuckled.
What fun!
Said the griffin, half to itself and half to Alice.
What is the fun?
Why, she. It's all her fancy that they never executes nobody, you know. Come on.
Everybody says come on here. I never was so ordered about in all my life. Never.
Alice thought, as she went slowly after it. They had not gone far before they saw the mock turtle in the distance, sitting sad and lonely on a little ledge of rock, and as they came nearer, Alice could hear him sighing as if his heart would break. She pitied him deeply.
What is his sorrow?
She asked the griffin, and the griffin answered, very nearly in the same words as before.
It's all his fancy that. He hasn't got no sorrow, you know. Come on.
So they went up to the mock turtle, who looked at them with large eyes full of tears, but said nothing.
This here young lady, she wants for to know your history, she do.
I'll tell her. Sit down, both of you, and don't speak a word till I've finished.
So they sat down, and nobody spoke for some minutes. Alice thought to herself,
I don't see how he can ever finish if he doesn't begin.
Once I was a real turtle.
These words were followed by a very long silence, broken only by an occasional
Huh?
Thank you, sir, for your interesting story.
But she could not help thinking there must be more to come, so she sat still and said nothing.
When we were little, we went to school in the sea. The master was an old turtle. We used to call him Tortoise.
Why did you call him Tortoise if he wasn't one?
We called him Tortoise because he taught us. Really, you are very dull.
You ought to be ashamed of yourself for asking such a simple question,
added the griffin, and then they both sat silent and looked at poor Alice, who felt ready to sink into the earth. At last the Griffin said to the Mock Turtle,
"Drive on, old fellow. Don't be all day about it. Yes, we went to school in the sea, though you mayn't believe it."
I never said I didn't.
You did.
Hold your tongue.
We had the best of educations. In fact, we went to school every day.
I've been to a day school too. You needn't be so proud of that.
With extras
Yes, we learned French and music.
and washing.
Certainly not.
Huh. Then yours wasn't a really good school. Now at ours, they had at the end of the bill French, music, and washing extra.
You couldn't have wanted it much living at the bottom of the sea.
I couldn't afford to learn it. I only took the regular course.
What was that?
Reeling and writhing, of course, to begin with, and then the different branches of arithmetic. Ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision.
I never heard of uglification before. What is it?
The Griffin lifted up both its paws in surprise.
What? Never heard of uglifying? You know what to beautify is, I suppose.
Yes. It means to make anything prettier?
Well then, if you don't know what to uglify is, you are a simpleton.
Alice did not feel encouraged to ask any more questions about it, so she turned to the Mock Turtle and said,
What else had you to learn?
Well, there was mystery.
The Mock Turtle replied, counting off the subjects on his flappers.
Mystery, ancient and modern, with seography, then drawing. The drawing master was an old conger eel that used to come once a week. He taught us drawing, stretching, and fainting in coils.
What was that like?
Well, I can't show it to you myself. I'm too stiff, and the Griffin never learnt it.
Hadn't time. I went to the classics master, though. He was an old crab, he was.
I never went to him. He taught laughing and grief. They used to say.
So he did. So he did.
And both creatures hid their faces in their paws.
And how many hours a day did you do lessons?
10 hours the first day, 9 the next, and so on.
What a curious plan.
That's the reason they're called lessons. Because they lesson from day to day.
This was quite a new idea to Alice, and she thought it over a little before she made her next remark.
Then the 11th day must have been a holiday?
Of course it was.
And how did you manage on the 12th?
That's enough about lessons. Tell her something about the games now.
PTAC's audio drama series is a production by the Phoenix Theater and Arts Company. This week's episode, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland Part 3, was written by Lewis Carroll, adapted and directed by Jenna Isabella, and edited by Gina Stanton. This episode features the vocal talents of Amanda Booth as the Queen of Hearts, the Duchess, the Dormouse, the Mock Turtle, and Card 5. Jenna Isabella as the March Hare, Card 2, and Soldier. John Isabella as the Rabbit, the Hatter, Card 7, and Soldier. Phil Pinot as the Cheshire Cat, the King, and the Griffin. Gina Stanton as the narrator, and Sam Steer as Alice. Original PTAC music by Brian Stanishin. For a full listing of credits, visit us at phoenixtheaterartsco.com. That's theater with an R-E. While you're there, please consider clicking the donate link. That would be delightful. Have comments or questions? Email us at phoenixtheaterartsco@gmail.com or find us on social media. A very special thank you to our Patreon subscribers, with a shout out to those sitting in the box seats, Ken Shelby, and onstage seating, Margaret Thurston. We couldn't do this without you. Join us next week for part 4 of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland.